Good morning, Columbus. Good morning, Innovate. Good morning to The Ohio State University. I'm still learning all the details here involving these big rivalries. I got a note regarding my presentation that if I use the letter M too often, it might not actually run on local computer systems, which is weird, but I'm trying to find a way to run with it. It is amazing to be with you on this beautiful spring day, but I actually want to take you to where I'm from, which is Western Massachusetts, up against the border with New York State. And I want to take you very specifically to the edge of a farm field just off the Appalachian Trail, where this monument is more or less ignored. You really have to go looking for this little piece of rock, which is reminding us of a moment in American history called Shay's Rebellion. Now, unless you're a history teacher, Shay's Rebellion may not be the first thing on your mind. It's dimly in the back of your head. You know you learned about it in 8th grade, but that was a long, long time ago. Shay's Rebellion is one of those really strange moments in American history. It happens just after the Revolutionary War and just before we end up with the constitutional state that we have today. And what happens in it is that my neighbors in Western Massachusetts get back from fighting the Revolutionary War. They show up on their farms in Western Massachusetts, and suddenly they are faced with two problems. They have not been paid for their military service, and they're experiencing these massive tax bills from the state that they're now part of. And people are starting to show up and claim their farms, and this one guy, Daniel Shay, who's a former captain in the Massachusetts Regiment, starts organizing groups of men to go protest at courthouses and say, wait a second, this is not the country that we had been working for. We weren't looking for a country where we would come home and we would be thrown out of our own farms. And they end up trying to storm the Springfield Armory to take all the weapons from Western Massachusetts so they can have a rebellion against the taxes being sent to them for Boston. This is the sort of thing that is really weirding out George Washington, right? He's looking at this and saying, this is crazy. We just founded this nation together. We got together, we overthrew tyranny. How is it possible that we have people in our own country who rule themselves who are now engaged in armed insurrection? And it really was an armed insurrection. There was this huge battle in Springfield, and that monument out there in that farmer's field is the last stand in the battle before Daniel Shay and his men flee into New York and then up into the lawless territory of Vermont. Now, it turns out that not everybody viewed this the same way that Washington did. Washington was so freaked out about this that he, along with Andrew Hamilton, hold a convention down in Annapolis, Maryland. And at that convention, the founders get together and say, wait a second, this is crazy. We need to have a standing army. We need some way of putting down domestic rebellion. We need a much stronger federal government. These Articles of Confederation aren't going to work. We're going to need a constitution. And if you want to know how Shay's Rebellion leads directly to the U.S. Constitution, keep in mind that you have two factions at that meeting. You have the Federalists led by Hamilton, and you have the Shayites. So they're literally the folks who are arguing against a central government. Now, you may remember from the Hamilton soundtrack that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton do not get along very well. And you might be unsurprised that Jefferson feels slightly differently about Shay's Rebellion than Hamilton does. And he ends up saying, I hold it that a little revolution now and again is a good thing. He goes on to make this argument that within a government, you are always going to have rebellion, and that sort of rebellion is not only healthy, it shows you where the state is not working well. And he, in fact, goes on to urge the leaders of Massachusetts not to treat the people from Shay's Rebellion too harshly. And in fact, that is what turns out to happen. There's more than 4,000 people who participate in the rebellion. Only 18 of them, the ringleaders, go to trial. The only ones who end up being prosecuted are not the ones who lead the rebellion, they're the ones who engage in looting. So 2 people end up serving jail time. Shays himself comes back to Massachusetts after his sojourn in Vermont and collects an army pension. So we in the United States are actually pretty good at making space for our rebels. And one of the things to keep in mind is that what it means to be a good citizen in this country is always changing. And in the 1700s, being a good citizen meant picking up a weapon and fighting for the government. And at different moments, at different times, we have asked citizens to do different things for the country. But what this means is that we really have to question, what does it mean to be a good civic actor? Because some days it's about showing up to the polls and voting, and some days it might actually be about taking to the streets and saying, this isn't working, this is unfair, we need some sort of change. There's a real tendency right now in America to complain about the state of our union and to complain about civics. And there's a lot of things to complain about, but one of the least fair criticisms is one in which we blame this problem on youth. There's a real tendency to say, hey, look, once you're above 30, the voting rate goes way up, these 18-year-olds don't vote, clearly they are the problem. We have wonderful folk like Sandra Day O'Connor coming in and saying, we have a crisis in civics, we're not teaching it well, people aren't participating in it, and I just don't think that's true. I actually look at it in a very, very different way. When we saw the shootings at Marjory Stoneman Douglas School in Parkland, Florida, we saw a remarkable display of civics and very different models of citizenship. We saw many of the survivors of that shooting show up in the Florida state legislature and demand from their legislators real gun control. And they were met almost immediately by the ways in which that's an incredibly difficult issue. And in fact, what the Florida state legislature did was they largely refused to meet with the students, and they passed a symbolic piece of legislation restricting access to pornography in the fear that that was what was actually causing the moral decay and disorder that ended up affecting the students. The students did not respond by saying, hey, you know what, to heck with this, civics doesn't work. Instead, they took to a whole different set of tactics. They started leading marches and rallies all throughout the nation, and they started looking for other targets that they were able to move and shift through civic action, even if they couldn't move their own legislature. And they had some amazing achievements, including getting assault weapons taken out of many major retailers. Now, however you end up feeling about the goals of these students, they were incredibly effective in having civic action in one fashion or another, even though it ended up looking like a very, very different form of civics than we usually teach in high school or in college. And so what I want to put forward is this idea that the way that we do civics in the United States right now may be changing quite radically. And the way that we help our students think about how they make an impact on the world has to change at the same time. It's a very, very helpful book. I really enjoyed it. It came out a couple of years ago from Chris Hayes. He introduces early on in this book this idea that left and right doesn't describe our politics adequately anymore. If you want to get beyond left and right and sort of understand what's actually going on in politics, you need another pair of terms. You need institutionalist and insurrectionist. Institutionalists are people who believe that the basic institutions, whether it's Congress, whether it's universities, whether it's banks, whether it's churches, they believe that these institutions are well suited to the world that we live in today. And that what we need are more thoughtful, wonderful people to step into these institutions and help them rise to their potential. And then we have insurrectionists, who are a bunch of people who say, have you looked at those institutions lately? Do you really think that they're actually doing the job? Are you sure that those are the institutions that we need? We may need something radically different. The system as we see it right now is not working for us. And unless we're actually going to make some serious structural changes, we don't expect any major change to happen. Now, what's interesting is that you can be right an insurrectionist, you can also be left an insurrectionist. On the right side, we've seen President Trump's election, who has come in with a promise to drain the swamp. We've seen the Brexit movement coming out of the UK, essentially saying we absolutely do not trust the EU towards our future. But in a funny way, for many of us, insurrection came first from the left. It came from political movements in Europe like Podemos. It came from the Occupy movement, where people got together and over the course of a year said, look, we're not just looking to elect different people. We have to go after the whole system. We have to change capitalism as it works, and we have to get into a new paradigm of one fashion or another. And I want to argue that insurrectionism is on the rise. It is the spirit of the moment, and it has to do with an incredible decrease in trust. This graph shows a very simple question. The question is, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? And when you asked Americans this question in 1964, 77% of them said, yes, we trust the government in Washington all or most of the time. And you can see that graph has really moved pretty steadily in one direction. And that graph doesn't move anymore, right? All through the Obama presidency into the Trump presidency, that graph has been stuck at about 18%. We have gone from a world a little bit before I was born where 4 out of 5 people would tell you that they trusted the government to one in which fewer than 1 in 5 will tell you that. And that is an utterly enormous shift. It is not just the government in Washington. You can look at almost any institution in American life. You can look at banks, you can look at churches, you can look at big business, you can look at the healthcare system, newspapers, broadcast media, criminal justice. We have lost confidence and trust in all of these systems over the last 30, 40, 50 years. There's only 2 institutions on this graph that have increased in trust. One is the military, and you know what? That's not great news. You really don't want to be living in a society where the only thing that people trust is the military. The other is small business, which is not an institution, right? By definition, it's interacting with a person rather than interacting with that larger entity. It's also not just the United States. There's a group called Edelman. They do a project called the Trust Barometer. They look at trust in all different aspects of society. And what they found is that this pattern that we're having in the United States, we're sort of in the middle of the pack. If you want low trust, go to Spain, go to France, go to Greece, go to a lot of these European nations where they have even lower confidence that systems are working on their behalf. And so what I want to suggest is that as we think about teaching people about civics, and by civics, I don't just mean I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill, I'm sitting here in Capitol Hill. I mean every aspect of how citizens have effect on their lives, whether it's changing within the institutions they're within, like a school, or changing the larger nation they're within. I'm really thinking of this question of efficacy. How do we ask young people to feel like they can have some sort of positive effect on the world around them? As we ask this question, we have to remember that some large percentage of the people that we're talking to, as soon as you say, well, write your congressman, their response is 9% of Americans think that Congress is doing a good job. Why would I possibly do that? You don't understand. You're lying to me. You don't understand how the world works. We are teaching civics to insurrectionists, and we've got to learn how to get good at it. Here's the beginning of a path to getting good at it. My friend Larry Lessig wrote a book about 20 years ago called Code. And this book is largely known because it made the argument, which was really radical at the time, that code, the things that computers run on, can have the same effect as law. If we end up building a system, it says you can do this thing, you can't do that thing, it can constrain our behavior just as effectively as laws constrain behavior. And Larry made the case that there's 4 basic ways that we constrain each other as humans. We pass laws. If you do that, I'm going to arrest you, I'm going to lock you up. We have social norms. We follow certain rules and scripts. None of you have stepped up and started yelling back to me yet. None of you are holding side conversations. There's very powerful social norms about what happens when someone is up on a stage. No one's going to arrest you if you do it, but people might shun you, they might get angry at you, and that's how norms enforce themselves. Two that are even weirder, more subtle. Markets are a very powerful way of making change. If anyone's a smoker, you may have discovered that over the last 10 or 20 years, that's become a very expensive habit. That's ways in which society has used a price signal to try to change and regulate your behavior. And then finally, code. There are ways that you can make systems, not just computers, but any technical system, make some behavior easy to do and some behavior hard to do. What I see as far as teaching civics to insurrectionists is that we need to take this model and turn it inside out, because every one of these ways to constrain human behavior, to control it, to regulate it, becomes a possible tool for change. So here's a way to think about this. I care a great deal about global warming, and it's really, really hard in the United States right now to feel like we are doing our part around these issues. And honestly, we weren't doing it under the last administration. We're probably not doing it under this administration. But there are some moments where it's a little bit of hope. And one of them has been the rise of electric cars. I now drive an electric car, and I drive it not just because electric cars are good for the environment, but honestly, it's a great car. No, I am not wealthy enough to own a Tesla. I own a Chevy Bolt. It's a nice American car. But hey, credit to Tesla. Tesla took the electric car and made it sexy as hell. And so even if we don't have laws in place that say you've got to drive an electric car, we suddenly have cost-competitive electric cars that are really fun and really exciting. And that's a way of leveraging market forces so that we start moving away from internal combustion and towards a different model. That market-based form of change may turn out to be almost as effective as legislating a change away from internal combustion engines. Here's another issue I care about: privacy. I spend a lot of my time interacting with people all over the globe via digital technologies, which means the NSA is watching what I say to them, because that is something that we decided at an administrative level that we do. But I don't really enjoy being watched, and so I rely on this funny-looking guy. This guy's name is Moxie Marlinspike. And the funny thing about Moxie is he has probably had a greater effect on privacy and security than any other individual in the world. Who here knows what WhatsApp is? Seen a couple of hands, quite a few hands, good. WhatsApp is a messaging service that is the default in most of the world. In most countries outside of the US, this is what you use instead of text messages. This is how you interact with people. Moxie built a piece of software years ago called Signal. Signal is incredibly strongly encrypted. It's really, really hard for the NSA to break. I know this is true because Ed Snowden was the guy who taught me to use it, and I use it every day. And Moxie did something really remarkable. He took the code from Signal, and he got it built into WhatsApp. And that means that the 1.2 billion people around the world using WhatsApp have communication that is basically invulnerable to the NSA. We were never going to get a bill passed in the United States securing electric privacy, but one hacker found a way to make this change by changing the code that influences the world. And believe me, when I teach at a place like MIT, this is the sort of change that my students are looking for. Can we find a way to hack the tech and have a way of changing the political world? But there's a couple of other ways to think about change that I want to talk about as well. When we teach civics in the United States, we're almost always teaching the idea of making change through law. And change through law is remarkable. I hail back here to the March on Washington, to the Civil Rights Movement, to this idea that people could stand up and say, look, we need equal rights for black and white Americans. We cannot distinguish your rights based on the color of your skin. And this is a great achievement that the US made. And we're seeing it lead into other achievements like equal rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender Americans as well. The trick is the method is slightly different than what we think. And let me explain for a second. Here's how Americans felt about interracial marriage. When we had the key decisions, Loving versus Virginia, that made it possible for black and white Americans, there was incredibly low support for interracial marriage. It's somewhere around 17%. What happens at that point is that the Supreme Court stands up and says, we don't care if you like this or not, we get that you don't like it, but this is the right thing to do, and we're going to go ahead and do it. And we tend to assume in social change that that's how change happens. We get laws, they change how society works, everything is different going forward, but that isn't really the way things happen these days. Here's how we've worked around this question of equal marriage. We have reached a point at which equal marriage is acceptable to the majority of Americans far before we have the court decision coming into place. And what this leads me to conclude now is that these days norms tend to precede laws. If you want to make change in the United States right now, you probably have to change hearts and minds before you go ahead and change laws, particularly as the nature of the Supreme Court is changing. And I don't just mean the last couple of years, I really mean the last few decades. We're now reaching a point where activism around norms and using social norms as a way of changing laws is probably the easiest point of access for young Americans. And so one of the places where I've seen this the most strongly in the last couple of years was around the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly around the death of Michael Brown. And we all remember Mike Brown's death in Ferguson, Missouri, but some of the details you may not remember is how Mike Brown was portrayed in the wake of that death. That image up there of Mike Brown standing up, flashing a peace sign, shot from below so that he looks very tall and very big and a little bit dangerous, that was the image that most newspapers used to portray Mike Brown. And people started saying, wait a second, that's off his Facebook page, so's this other image of Mike Brown. Shot head on, you get a sense for who he is. He's a kid. He's a chubby kid. He's just getting out of high school. He's not fully grown. It's a very, very different picture of the same young man. And a lot of people on Twitter started saying, wait a second, if I got killed, if I was killed by police gunfire, how would I get portrayed? And young African Americans said, I know how I'd get portrayed. I'd be portrayed in the worst conceivable light. And so people went onto their personal Facebook feeds. They looked for the photo at which they looked at their worst versus the one at which they looked at their best. And you can see this young man portraying himself flipping the bird, and then also in Marine Corps full dress uniform. This idea went wildly viral. Within 3 days, there were tens of thousands of posts about this. Within 3 days, the front page of the New York Times had this image about the phenomenon. And we know that this had effect, and we know it because if you search for Mike Brown today, the only time you find that first photo is on a version of this slide deck that I have up on Google. It's otherwise disappeared. People have felt this is not an image that we wanted associated with this young man. We wanted a more neutral image. Why does this matter? It matters because media has enormous power in setting our norms. And right now, when you talk to young people, when young people are trying to figure out how to be effective, how to make change in the world, their natural impulse is to try to figure out how to influence media because they understand, often much better than we do, that how media portrays the world is the way that we end up shaping the world and creating the world that we want. So some of my heroes who are trying to figure out how to make change as insurrectionists. This is my dear friend Adam Foss. Adam's an interesting guy. Grew up in Boston, raised by white parents. He's of Afro-Colombian descent. Went to a really good college, playing in a punk rock band. Came out of law school, decided that he was going to become a prosecutor, and joins the Suffolk County DA, so prosecuting young men in Boston. And he gets on the job, and within a couple of weeks, he realizes, wait a second, I am prosecuting all these kids who look like me. and my job is to lock him up and put him into jail, and this does not feel like a great thing to be doing. And so he starts researching, and he realizes that the truth is, as a prosecutor, you have incredible discretion. You can help people. You don't just have to imprison them. You can send them off. You can find ways to send them into drug treatment. You can divert them. You can have them do community service. And so he starts working on this idea that prosecutors need to be retrained. We need to change the toolkit. We need to go back to the core of what it is that we hope a DA does, which is achieves justice, not necessarily achieves incarceration. Adam now leads a movement retraining DAs all over the United States to do this sort of work. And I call Adam a radical institutionalist. He's someone who's chosen to work within an institution, but he's bringing that institution back to its core values. He's taking that core value of justice and he's overcoming the ways in which that institution now seems to be more about incarceration than it is about trying to rebuild and re-heal communities. And radical institutionists all over the country are people looking into an institution and saying, if I get inside this and if I bring it back to what this institution is really supposed to be about, I can change everything. Here's another project that I really love. This is a project run by my friend Luigi Reggi out of Italy. It's called Monathon. And what Luigi realized was that there's all these young people, they want to participate in hackathons, but they don't necessarily know how to code. And so he had this interesting idea. He said, well, wait a second. Italians really don't like the EU, but none of them actually know what the EU does. What if we went out and we looked at EU projects? We would take a high school class, we'd go visit an EU-funded project, and we would evaluate it. We would take a really hard look. Is there corruption? Did they actually build what they wanted to build? Are we actually getting our money's worth? And this is now called Monathon. It's actually part of the high school curriculum as last year high school students in Italy. Groups of students go out to local civic projects and they monitor them, they audit them, essentially. And they show up and essentially say, I'm a citizen, I have the right to see where my tax money is going. This is something that I call counter-democracy. It's a way of looking at democratic systems and saying, I'm going to put pressure on them, I'm going to push on them, I'm going to make sure that they're still standing. And that pressure is actually going to make democracy stronger. I look like a pain in the ass because I'm coming in and I'm asking you these hard questions, but what I'm really doing is making you better at what you do. And this happens all sorts of different ways. We can see it now with movements that are doing things like going out and filming arrests, groups like Copwatch that are trying to hold police departments accountable. Here's a third method. I was recently in Taiwan. You saw some of my earlier slides. They were looking at Taiwanese protests. Those Taiwanese protests ended up kicking out the existing government, put new government in place. And when that new government came into place, it was filled with computer hackers. It's a group that calls themselves Gov0. And they're really interesting and really innovative because they believe that by going into government, they can radically change how government institutions work. There's a program right now in Taiwan where you can apply to waive a law that's on the books. You can go in and say, interesting. Ride-sharing services are illegal in Taiwan. I'd like a 1-year waiver from that, please. And you can apply. You can have a law not apply to you for a year. And then at the end of the year, you show what you were able to do as a business without that law in place. And if you're able to show that that law was what was holding you back from building an exciting new business, they'll take the law off the books. They call this forking the government in the same way that you fork a software project. This is crazy, but it's real, and it's happening right now. It's happening in part because one of the organizers, one of the hackers, Audrey Tan, is now a minister within the Taiwanese government. So this is a government that is inviting its citizens to literally go and hack those institutions. And that question of disruption, of going and saying, this institution is broken, I'm going to find a way to work around it, and if I do it in a successful way, we're going to make change in the wake. This is something that's incredibly inspiring. I've thrown a lot out to you right now. You may be asking at this point, what is it that you want me to take away from this? And what I want you to take away is this. I don't care if you come out of this talk singing, clearly I'm an insurrectionist, that's how I view the world, or coming out of this and saying, institutions are incredibly important. Those are both completely valid stances. You might be coming out of this saying, I'm a coder, I want to try to figure out how to change the world through code. You might be coming out of this and saying, law is really the way you want to make change. I don't care. What I care about is efficacy. What I worry about is a world in which we feel like the systems are broken and we end up deciding to sit on the sidelines instead. And what I want to do is help all of us as educators, as coaches, as leaders, to help our students, help anyone we work with, find a way to go out into the world and make a real impact on it. There is no better way to learn about civics than by participating in it. And that doesn't necessarily mean a voter registration drive. That might mean a social media campaign. It's not our job to tell the students what to work on. Our job is to help them choose and to help them, once they're doing it, figure out how to use a strategy that leads them to success. And then the last thing is that this work is really, really hard. And that as students start doing this work, they're going to fail, and they're going to fail a lot, and most revolutions fail. Most people end up fleeing Western Massachusetts and going into the wilds of Vermont. But over time, that is the change that we need. We need people to be willing to get off the sidelines, to get into the battlefield, and to try to have an effect on the world. Thank you all so much.